The crash on Route 9 looked like a single car accident. One victim, airbags deployed, minor injuries. The morning air smelled like pine sap and engine coolant, and the shoulder of the road was empty, except for Jim's rig and the silver Dodge Ram sitting crooked against the guardrail. The tick of a cooling radiator. The flat gray weight of a Tuesday sky pressing down through bare trees. Jim Stead crouched beside the driver's door with both hands steady and his kit open on the asphalt, and the static of his radio a low hiss at his shoulder. He had worked 847 calls in 11 years, and this one had every signature of a simple Monday. Paramedic Jim Stead had the scene under control in 4 minutes. Then the victim's shepherd mix started pulling toward the tree line and wouldn't stop. And Jim made the choice that would haunt him either way. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe and like this video. And before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love knowing who's out there listening. Jim Stead was 41 years old and had been a paramedic for 11 years. Before that, he was a combat medic, 12 years in the Army, 2 of them in Kandahar province, 1 of them in Mosul, and the last one at Fort Bragg doing paperwork while his hands forgot how to be still. He came home in 2011 with a duffel bag, a general discharge he didn't explain to people, and a recurring dream where he was always moving towards something and never quite arriving. He retrained as a civilian paramedic at 31, did his certification at Leicester County Community College, sitting in plastic chairs next to kids half his age. He was faster than all of them and quieter than most of them, and his instructor told him he had good hands and too much silence. Jim took that as a compliment and bought the man a cup of coffee. He worked the overnight rotation out of Station 4, 12-hour shifts, 4 days on, 3 days off. He kept his apartment the way he kept his rig, clean, organized, nothing out of place. The refrigerator was always half empty. He had a dog once, a yellow lab named Birch, who died at 14 2 winters back. He hadn't gotten another one. He thought about it every few weeks the way you think about calling someone you haven't called in a long time. Then he thought about something else, and the moment passed. He was good at the job because the mate had a logic that made sense to him. You showed up, you assessed, you acted. The variables were unpredictable, but the framework held. In Kandahar, the framework was sometimes the only thing that held, and Jim had learned to grip it hard and not let go. He had been on the Route 9 call for exactly 4 minutes when he started noticing the things that didn't fit. The silver Dodge Ram had hit the guardrail on the driver's side, but the damage pattern ran front to back along the passenger quarter panel. That was the first thing, not a drift into the rail, a push. The second thing, the airbags had deployed fully, but the driver, Marcus Webb, according to the registration, had no bruising on his forearms from the bag's impact. Full deployment left marks, almost always. Third thing, Marcus hadn't asked about his truck. In 11 years, Jim had worked crashes where people were unconscious, crashes where people were screaming, and crashes where people were eerily calm. But the calm ones always asked about their vehicles eventually. Marcus Webb was sitting on the guardrail with both hands pressed flat against his thighs and his eyes moving steadily along the tree line. Not like a man who'd been shaken by an accident, like a man watching for something. Jim filed all 3 and kept moving. The dog's tag said Hatch. And then Hatch turned toward the tree line and pulled hard enough to creak the truck door on its hinges. Jim's backup was Terry Voss, 12 years on the job and the kind of paramedic who talked while she worked and worked while she talked, and somehow neither activity suffered for it. She pulled up in the second rig at 7:22 in the morning, stepping out with her kit already open and her eyes already reading the scene. Jim gave her the handoff in 4 words. Alert GCS-15, lacerations. And she nodded once, crossed to Marcus Webb, and took over the assessment without breaking stride. That should have been the end of Jim's involvement. He was standing at the tree line instead. It had happened while Terry was still parking. Hatch had shifted, not panicked, shifted. The dog had been standing quiet against the truck for 4 minutes, and then something changed in the dog's posture, some incremental adjustment that was barely visible if you weren't watching for it, and Jim had been watching for it without knowing why. Hatch turned north, ears up, weight forward, not the movement of an animal smelling something interesting. the movement of an animal that had made a decision. Jim walked to the truck and unclipped the lead from the door handle. He told himself he was going to check the embankment for secondary debris. It was a reasonable explanation, the kind that would hold up if Terry asked. He told himself that for about 30 seconds. Then he stopped telling himself anything and just followed the dog. Hatch moved at a pace Jim could match. Not fast, not slow. The pace of something that knew where it was going and was confident you'd keep up. Into the tree line, angling north and slightly downhill through second-growth pine and scrub oak. The ground was soft from 2 days of rain. 40 feet in, the noise from Route 9 dropped. 60 feet in, it was gone almost entirely. The world compressed to pine smell, and the soft sound of their footsteps and the flat, gray morning light coming down through the canopy in weak columns. Jim had followed a lot of things into dark places. He'd followed orders into a compound in Panjwai district at 2 in the morning when everything in him said, turn around. He'd followed a gut feeling into a burning apartment in 2016 and pulled a woman out with 40 seconds to spare. He'd learned through practice rather than instruction the difference between the pull that means danger and the pull that means move. The first one tightened your throat. The second one steadied your hands. His hands were steady. At 90 feet in, Hatch stopped. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, simply stopped, turned its head left toward a dense cluster of river birch where the ground dropped into a shallow drainage channel, and looked. Jim looked. He saw nothing at first, just trees, gray light, mud and pine needles, and the distant sound of a small creek. He stood still and let his eyes adjust and his ears open up the way he'd learned to do in another country, in another decade, when stillness was sometimes the only intelligence available. Then he heard it, breathing, ragged and controlled, the particular sound of a person trying not to breathe audibly and not quite succeeding, the effort making it louder in a specific way, a rhythmic suppression that was worse than silence. Jim had heard it twice before, both times in Kandahar. Both times someone was trying to decide what to do next. If you've ever stood in a quiet place and realized someone nearby was trying not to be heard, you already know that it changes the air around you. It changes the temperature of the moment. You feel it before you understand it. Jim didn't move. He just listened. Hatch sat down beside him and did the same. 20 feet ahead, maybe closer. The breathing was coming from behind the birch cluster at the edge of the drainage channel, moving slightly, not stationary, shifting weight, the way a person shifted when they'd been crouching too long and were fighting the discomfort. Jim clocked the position and then clocked the direction of the movement, southwest, curving back toward the road, toward Route 9, toward Marcus Webb sitting on that guardrail watching the trees. Jim keyed his radio low and close to his mouth. Voss, I'm in the tree line north of the vehicle. Possible second subject. Flag the sheriff's unit when they arrive. A pause. Then Terry's voice, cautious. Copy. You okay? Working on it. He turned the volume down to almost nothing. Hatch hadn't moved. The dog's eyes were fixed on the birch cluster with the same flat, patient attention it had used to watch Jim work the scene. Not threatening, not frightened. Waiting. Jim waited too. The man in the woods was moving in a slow arc back toward the road, and Jim had no weapon, no backup within reach, and a dog he'd known for 6 minutes. He also had 18 years of combined military and civilian experience reading people in the worst moments of their lives. In Kandahar, you got very good, very fast, at distinguishing between a person who was dangerous and a person who had already made a decision to be dangerous, because those were two different things and they required two different responses. A person who was dangerous could sometimes be reasoned with. A person who had already decided was a different problem entirely. Jim didn't know yet which one he had. He moved forward. Hatch moved with him. The drainage channel ran perpendicular to their path, cutting a shallow 6-inch depression through the hillside. The river birch thickened on the near bank. Jim stopped at the edge of the channel and crouched slightly, dropping his profile, and looked through the birch trunks. The man was 20 feet away, crouched behind the thickest cluster of trees, one knee in the mud, one hand flat against a trunk. Dark jacket, navy or black, hard to tell in the morning light. No visible injuries. His weight was balanced forward on the balls of his feet, which told Jim he was ready to move. His head was turned slightly toward the gap in the trees that opened toward Route 9. He wasn't hiding from the road. He was watching it. Jim's pulse was at about 90. His hands were still. He kept his breathing shallow and even and studied the man for 30 seconds before he moved or spoke. 41 years old, medium build, running slightly heavy. The dark jacket was zipped to the chin, right hand out of sight, tucked against his body in a way that could mean nothing or could mean something. Left hand on the tree trunk, fingers pressed flat, the grip of a person managing their own tension. Hatch remained sitting. The dog's ears had rotated forward and stayed there. Jim stood up to his full height and said, "Sir." The man's head snapped around. The raid came in fast, the way it always did after you'd done this long enough. Eyes to Jim's hands first, then to the Joaquin, then to Jim's chest. Not his face. Calculating what Jim had, what Jim was, and what Jim's options were. The left shoulder dropped a fraction of an inch, rotating inward. The right hand, still hidden, shifted. 3 seconds. Jim said, "I'm the paramedic who responded to the accident on Route 9. If you're injured, I need to know." The man said nothing. "I don't have a weapon. I have a radio and a bow. I'm not a cop." A long pause. Wind moved through the birch tops. Somewhere behind Jim, back on the road, traffic had begun to slow. Rubberneckers. The inevitable accumulation of bodies that any roadside incident attracted. The man said, "That your dog?" "No, another pause. "Then you should stay out of this." "You might be right," Jim said. "Tell me what this is." "You already know what this is." "I've got some guesses. I'd rather hear it from you." The man's jaw worked. His eyes moved to Hatch again, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but complicated. The dog was still sitting, still patient, looking at the man with the same direct, uninflected attention it had been giving Jim all morning. "That dog know you?" the man asked. "I told you, not my dog." "Then why's it with you?" Jim thought about that for a second. "Same reason I'm out here. It knows something that hasn't been said yet." The man looked at Jim for a long moment, then back at the dog, then back toward the road. His right hand finally came forward, and Jim watched it come, ready, calibrated, waiting to see what was in it. The hand was empty. Jim let out a slow, controlled breath. He didn't show it. "Right pocket," the man said, almost to himself. "It's not there." He said it like he was confirming something to himself, like he'd been checking that fact mentally for a while and was only now saying it out loud. "I left it." "Left what?" The man shook his head, not refusing to answer, processing, like the question had reached him a half second before he was ready for it. Behind Jim, back on Route 9, a second siren approached and cut. Short, authoritative. "Sheriff's unit." The man heard it. His whole body changed register. The held tension sharpened into something different, something that sat right at the edge of a decision. Jim said, "Whatever you're thinking right now, the wrong version of this ends with you in the back of a cruiser and adds another charge to what you're already looking at. You don't know what I'm looking at. I know you ran a man's truck into a guardrail." The man went very still. "I know you followed him out here instead of stopping. I know you didn't stop because whatever you were planning on the road didn't go the way you planned it. And I know the reason it didn't go the way you planned it is standing right here and has been looking at you for the last 4 minutes." Hatch hadn't moved. The dog's gaze was fixed on the man with absolute, unbroken patience. 40 seconds of silence. Jim let it go the full 40 seconds without filling it. He'd learned that from a sergeant in Kandahar named Willis, who had been the best interrogator Jim ever met, and who never raised his voice. Willis said silence was a pressure you could apply without hands. Jim had never forgotten that. At 43 seconds, the man's right knee came down from its crouch and settled fully in the mud. His left hand dropped from the tree trunk. His shoulders moved down about an inch. He wasn't standing down entirely, but he was no longer on the edge of the decision. Jim said quietly, "Walk me through the road." The man looked at the ground. He said, "He ran a light." "Who did?" "The driver." Webb. At the intersection on Route 9 and Miller's Branch, he came through on a red and clipped my front quarter. I was already moving. He just, he didn't even slow down. Kept going. Jim didn't say anything. I followed him 6 miles. He never pulled over, never put his hazards on, just kept driving like it didn't happen. The man's voice had changed register, the tight control loosening, something underneath starting to surface, not anger, something older than anger. I've got $3,000 in damage to a car I've been making payments on for 2 years. I lost my insurance 3 weeks ago. One bad month. One bad month and I lost my coverage, and this guy clips me on a red light and just keeps going. So you followed him. I was going to make him stop. He paused, then lower. I had something. In my jacket pocket. I was going to make him pull over and get out and deal with it. A tire iron. The man looked up. It was in the car, Jim said, not your pocket. You had it in the car and you transferred it to your pocket when you decided to follow him, but somewhere between the intersection and here you thought better of it and put it back. Or you dropped it, or you left it in the car when you ran. The silence confirmed it. Which is it? A long pause. Left it in the car. When? When I heard the sirens. I came up on his passenger side. I knocked on the window. The dog went insane. It was just barking, but it was loud and I couldn't think and I was already angry and I got scared of the dog and I tried to get clear and I clipped the side of his truck and he went into the rail. Jim let that sit. He didn't know what was coming, the man said. The impact surprised him and he overcorrected. I watched it happen. And then you ran. And then I ran. He looked at his hands. I ran and I kept running and then I stopped about 100 feet in and I didn't know what to do. I didn't have the thing in my pocket anymore. I'd left it and I didn't know if he was hurt bad and I couldn't go back because I'd already run and I just stood here. He looked exhausted, not physically, the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had made several decisions in sequence, each one worse than the last, and had now arrived at the end of them with nowhere left to go. Jim said, "What's your name?" A pause. Dennis Crail." "How old are you, Dennis?" 44. "Any priors?" "2 citations. Nothing. No violence. Nothing like this." Jim nodded. He looked at Hatch. The dog was still sitting, still watching Crail with the same patient attention, and Jim thought about what Marcus Webb had not said but had communicated with his hands pressed flat against his thighs and his eyes moving along the tree line. The language of a man waiting to see if the thing that had happened to him was finished or still happening. Jim keyed his radio. "Voss, tell the sheriff's unit I've got a second subject in the tree line. Non-injured. He's going to walk out on his own." He looked at Crail. Crail looked at the dog for a long moment. Then he nodded. They walked. The trees thinned in stages. First, the river birch gave way to the pines, and the ground went from soft mud to a firmer mix of pine needles and clay, and the light came back gradually, the flat gray morning pressing through the canopy in wider columns. Then the pines thinned, and the embankment appeared, the long slope of cut earth and gravel that ran up to the shoulder of Route 9. And then they were out. Jim came through the tree line first, Hatch at his left leg, lead loose in his hand, Crail 2 steps behind, both hands visible at shoulder height, palms out. Deputy Rawlings had the scene organized with the economy of someone who had been doing this for 19 years. 2 cruisers parked at angles that blocked traffic from both directions. Flashers going. The second deputy, young, maybe 26, stationed near the guardrail, had clocked the tree line and had his hand on his belt before Jim was fully visible. Jim made eye contact with him and gave a slow, flat nod that meant, "I see you, I'm in control, stand down." The deputy's hand dropped. Rawlings crossed to them in 8 steps. She looked at Crail, looked at Jim, looked at the dog. "He come out on his own?" "Yes." She looked at Crail. "Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them and walk with me." Crail said, "Okay." He walked with her. The second deputy moved alongside them toward the cruiser. Jim stood on the shoulder and watched the procedural machinery engage, the calm professional choreography of law enforcement doing what law enforcement did when the immediate threat had resolved and the documentation phase began. He'd been on the other end of that machinery once, a long time ago, in a different context, and he had a specific and personal appreciation for how it felt from the outside. It felt like the ground becoming solid under you after a long time of it not being solid. It felt like being allowed to breathe normally. Hatch walked forward 3 steps and sat down facing the scene. Marcus Webb was still on the guardrail. He'd watched Crail come out of the tree line and his whole body had gone rigid. The full body clench of a person seeing the source of their fear materialize from the exact direction they'd been watching for 45 minutes. Then he saw the hands up. He saw Rawlings. He saw Jim. He let out a breath. It was the longest exhale Jim had ever clocked on a scene. A slow, complete release from somewhere deep. The kind of breath that a person held when they were in a situation they didn't control, and then finally the situation changed. His shoulders dropped 2 full inches. His hands, which had been pressing flat against his thighs since the moment Jim first arrived, relaxed and hung open at his sides for the first time all morning. Terry Voss came up beside Jim. She looked at Crail being walked toward the cruiser. She looked at Jim. She looked at the dog. She said, "Okay, tell me." "Road rage," Jim said. "Crail says Webb ran a light and clipped him 6 miles back at Miller's Branch. Followed him here. Came up on the passenger side with a tire iron in his jacket. Dog went off. Crail spooked, clipped the side of Webb's truck trying to get clear. Webb overcorrected and went into the rail. He have the tire iron? Left it in his car before he ran into the woods." Terry processed this. So Webb didn't do anything. Webb did nothing wrong. And Crail was in the woods, standing there trying to figure out what to do. Jim paused. He'd been standing there since it happened. Couldn't go back, couldn't leave, just standing there. Terry looked at the cruiser. What changed his mind? Jim didn't answer right away. He looked at Hatch. The dog was watching Marcus Webb now. Not Crail. Marcus. Watching him the way it had been watching the tree line from the accident scene. The specific, patient attention of an animal tracking something that mattered to it deeply, something it had decided was its concern. Dog changed it, Jim said. Terry looked at him sideways. The dog changed it. Crail was moving in a pattern back toward the road. He'd been circling for probably 20 minutes. When I came out of the tree line with something shifted for him. Jim thought about the moment. Crail's eyes going to Hatch, the complicated thing that had moved across his face. I don't fully understand it, but the dog sat down between us and then Crail's hands went empty and he started talking. Terry was quiet for a long moment. Hatch. Name's on the tag. Good name. She looked at the dog. Former K9? Moves like it, responds to positioning, not commands, placed itself between me and the subject. You let the patient's dog lead you half a mile into the woods alone. I radioed you first. You said possible second subject. That's different from I'm going after the man who caused this accident to see if I can talk him down with no weapon and a borrowed dog. Jim allowed that. Yes, it's different. Very good judgment or very bad judgment. We're only on the right side of it because of how it went. That's how judgment usually works. Terry looked at him for a long moment. Then she shook her head once, not in disapproval exactly, but in the way a person shook their head at something they'd witnessed and hadn't expected, and went back to her kit. Rawlings came over while her partner processed Crail at the cruiser. She had a notepad out and a pen ready, and she was direct, which Jim appreciated deeply. Walk me through the sequence from when you entered the tree line. He did. She listened without interrupting and without writing anything down while he was speaking, which was the method of an experienced investigator. She'd write after, when she had the whole picture. She asked 2 questions when he finished, whether Crail had made any explicit verbal threats, and whether Jim had at any point believed he was in immediate physical danger. Jim said no to both. He said it carefully and completely, because those were the accurate answers, and because Crail's decision in those woods, The hands going up voluntarily, the walkout without resistance, had been a genuine decision, and Jim was not going to characterize it in any way that made it sound otherwise. A man had made the worst choice of his life, and then, standing in the mud with a pipe watching him, had made a better one. Jim was not going to take that away from him by overstating what had happened. Rawlings noted something, looked at the dog again. "Is that yours?" "The victim's. Marcus Webb." She nodded, noted something else, and crossed back to her cruiser. The tow truck arrived at 7:51. Garrett, the driver, a big man with a coffee cup and the unhurried manner of someone who had never once been in a rush on a job, hooked up the ram with the focused indifference of a professional who needed no audience. Two additional vehicles had stopped on the shoulder, drawn by the lights. Rawlings' partner redirected them with the patient authority of someone who had done it many times and felt nothing in particular about having to do it again. A state trooper arrived, spoke to Marcus, spoke to Rawlings, logged the incident, and departed. The forms and reports and chain of custody paperwork began their long accumulation in the way such things always did. Slowly at first, then faster, the bureaucratic structure growing up around an incident the way vegetation grew back after a fire. Dennis Crail sat in the back of Rawlings' cruiser and stared at the floor. Jim looked at him once, through the window. Crail was sitting with his hands between his knees, shoulders bent slightly forward, the posture of a man who was doing a certain kind of internal accounting, going back through the morning one decision at a time, seeing each one in the light of where it had ended. He had a wife, Jim had learned from the information Rawlings relayed, 2 kids in middle school, a steady job, an insurance lapse that had been one bad month in a life that, until this morning, had not included anything like this. One bad month, one intersection, one decision made in the heat of something he hadn't known how to let go of. Jim looked away. He crossed to where Marcus Webb was sitting. Terry had finished her second assessment and was packing her kit. The butterfly strips had been replaced with proper closure strips, and the cut above Marcus's left eye was closed cleanly. It would need real stitches, but not urgently. No concussion indicators, no internal injury. He'd hit the guardrail at a low angle in a modern truck with a fully deploying airbag system, and the physics of that collision had, by a margin that was real but not large, been survivable without serious harm. If you've ever had a moment where you knew the margin was real but not large, you already know how Marcus Webb was sitting on that guardrail. Upright, present, quieter than he would be tomorrow when the weight of the morning caught up with the adrenaline that had been holding it off. Hatch walked beside Jim, and then, without instruction, crossed to Marcus and sat at his knee. Marcus's hand went to the dog's head automatically. The movement of a reflex, something his body did before his mind decided to. Jim crouched down across from him. "How are you doing?" Marcus looked at him, then at the dog. He went after him. "Yeah. Hatch, he went and got you." That's what it looked like from where I was standing. Marcus was quiet for a moment. His hand moved through the fur at the back of Hatch's neck in the slow, repetitive motion of a person steadying themselves on the only solid thing available. I knew he was still out there after the crash. I could feel it. I kept watching the tree line, but I couldn't. I hadn't seen him go in clearly enough to say anything, and I didn't know how to explain it. I just knew. "You were right." "I know I was right. That's the part that—" He stopped. I was sitting there knowing something was wrong, and I couldn't do anything about it. And he could. He could do something about it. He looked at the dog. He always does something when I can't. Jim didn't answer that. Some things didn't need an answer. Jim crouched on the shoulder of Route 9 while Terry finished her kit and the scene finished itself. And he thought about the 3 things he'd noticed in the first 4 minutes that hadn't fit. The airbag bruising that wasn't there. He'd thought about that one first, automatically, the way you thought about the most anomalous thing before anything else. Full airbag deployment on a fixed impact left bruising on the forearms almost universally. The bag deployed at 200 miles an hour, and the forearms absorbed the force. No bruising meant the impact wasn't fixed. It was lateral. The truck had been struck by a moving vehicle, and the driver's arms had been positioned differently than they would have been in a standard single-car drift. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Jim had been looking because 11 years of emergency medicine had trained him to notice what was wrong before he noticed what was right. The damage pattern that read push not drift. He'd stood at the driver's side and looked along the truck's body, and the story the metal told was consistent and clear. The guardrail contact was on the driver's side, yes. But the deformation started at the passenger front quarter panel and ran rearward. Not the pattern of a vehicle drifting left into a fixed barrier, but the pattern of a vehicle being pushing from the right by something that made contact in motion. A driver coming up fast on the passenger side, panicking, making contact and losing control of his own exit. That was the story. And Marcus hadn't asked about his truck. Jim had thought about that one longest. People always asked about their trucks, sometimes before they asked about their own injuries. Marcus Webb had been watching the tree line with both hands pressed flat against his thighs, the posture of someone holding their own body down, pressing on something to stop it from doing what the mind had decided was wrong. Staying still because moving was dangerous. Staying quiet because explaining was complicated. Marcus had known someone was out there. He'd known since the impact happened. He'd known he couldn't explain it in a way that wouldn't sound like nothing, so he'd sat still and pressed his hands into his legs and watched the tree line and waited for someone else to see it. The dog saw it. Jim thought about what that meant, then decided it didn't need to mean more than what it was. An animal trained to track and assess and respond to threat. A dog that had spent years developing the specific skill of reading a situation and acting before anyone said a word. A dog that saw what Marcus could not explain and went to get the one person on scene most likely to be useful. If you've ever trusted something before you understood it, you already know what Jim was sitting with on that shoulder of Route 9. He didn't try to analyze it further. At 8:04, Rawlings came back over one final time. One more question. When you found Crail in the tree line, was the dog alerting? Any signal behavior you can document for the report? Jim thought about it. He sat down between us. Maintained eye contact with the subject throughout. Bark or growl? No. Passive alert. She noted it. If this goes to a charging review, the K9 behavior is potentially useful context. Former working dog, passive alert on an unknown subject in a position of tactical advantage. She looked at Hatch, then at Jim. Good work. She said it without warmth, just with accuracy. She drove. The scene cleared by 8:15. The second cruiser pulled back to patrol. Terry finished her report in the rig. The winter sky had brightened to a lighter gray, the kind that had about 40 minutes left before the cold pushed back fully. Jim was still on the guardrail beside Marcus when Terry came back the last time. Okay, Marcus, hospital. Proper stitches. 2 hours. I'm fine. I know, 2 hours. Marcus looked at the dog, he looked at Jim, and then he asked the question. Marcus said, will you take him? Jim was crouching in front of the dog. He looked up. While I'm at the hospital, Marcus said, I don't want him in the impound lot with the truck. He doesn't like being locked up alone. Jim looked at Hatch. Hatch was looking at Jim with the same direct, patient attention it had been using on him since the moment he'd arrived on scene. Not performing, not asking, just waiting to see what he decided. I can take him to the station, Jim said. We've got a yard. Okay. Marcus's hand came off the dog's neck. He stood carefully, with the stiffness of someone whose body was beginning to register what it had been through. His food is in the truck, behind the seat. Blue container. He looked at Garrett loading the flatbed. Or it was. I'll get it. He's good on a lead, good in a car. He doesn't like thunderstorms, and he'll bark at motorcycles until they're out of range. Other than that, he's easy. Marcus paused. He used to work, before I got him. I don't know his full history. I got him from a rescue in Franklin 3 years ago. He was 4, they said. Maybe 5. They didn't know exactly. He knew commands I hadn't taught him. Sit, stay, heel. German ones, too. Platz, Fuss, here. Jim looked at the dog. Former K9. That's what I thought. Marcus looked at him. He doesn't go to everyone. I want you to know that. He's particular. He decides. Jim thought about the first 4 minutes on the shoulder of Route 9, the dog standing quiet against the truck, watching him work the assessment. The moment it had turned toward the tree line, not panicked, not random, deliberate, specific, like a piece of equipment activating because the conditions for activation had been met. He thought about Hatch sitting down between him and Dennis Crail in those woods, not aggressive, not frightened. Just present in the specific way that presence sometimes filled a space that words couldn't reach, that changed the temperature of a moment without doing anything visible. He thought about Birch, the yellow lab who had died on a Wednesday in November 2 winters ago and whom Jim had not replaced in 3 years, not for any reason he could have explained clearly, just hadn't. Every few weeks the thought arrived and then departed without resolution. "I'll keep him at the station," Jim said. "You call when you're done." Marcus nodded. He bent down and put both hands on either side of Hatch's face and held them there for a moment, looking at the dog. Hatch sat still, patient. Marcus said something low that Jim didn't catch. Then he straightened and walked with Terry to the ambulance. Jim stood up. Hatch stood up. They walked to the rig. Jim got the blue container from behind the truck seat before Garrett finished hooking up the tow. It was heavier than he expected. A good sign. Someone had kept this dog fed consistently, on a schedule, with care. Hatch waited at the rig's passenger door with the focused patience of an animal that understood how vehicles worked and was prepared to be professional about it. Jim opened the door. Hatch stepped in, without hesitation, turned twice on the floor mat behind the passenger seat, and lay down. Jim sat in the driver's seat. He didn't start the engine right away. The scene was winding down around him. The second cruiser pulled out. Rawlings had her window down and lifted 2 fingers in Jim's direction as she passed. The economy of acknowledgement that people in certain lines of work used with each other. The gesture that contained everything it needed to and nothing it didn't. Jim lifted his chin back. In the back, Hatch shifted and settled. A small sound, not a sigh exactly, but the physical equivalent of it. The sound of an animal that had done what it came to do and was prepared to rest now. Jim started the engine and drove. The shift had 9 hours left. 3 more calls came before it ended. The first was a fall victim on the east side, an elderly man named Gerald Hopwood, who had stepped off his back porch and broken his ankle and was sitting in the mud when Jim arrived, furious and embarrassed and insisting he could walk to the rig on his own. He could not. Jim helped him and didn't say much, which Gerald seemed to appreciate. The second call was a fender bender on the interstate. 2 drivers, both uninjured, both insisting the other was at fault. Jim documented and departed. The third call was the one he would remember. A 12-year-old girl named Sonia had fallen from a horse at a stable on the county's western edge. Broken collarbone. Not dangerous. Not pleasant. She was sitting in the barn aisle against a post when Jim arrived, both hands in her lap, not yet crying. The particular stillness of a kid absorbing something too fast for the tears to catch up. Jim ran the assessment. She answered his questions clearly and quietly. When he brought the stretcher for transport, Hatch walked beside him from the rig to the barn and sat down 3 feet from Sonia and looked at her. She said, "Can I hold his ear?" Jim looked at Hatch. The dog was already leaning slightly toward her. "Yeah," Jim said. She held Hatch's ear the entire drive to the hospital. Not pulling, just holding, the way you held something when you needed to not feel alone in it. At the hospital entrance, when the door opened, she looked at the dog and said, "Thank you." She said it to the dog, not to Jim. Jim did not feel slighted. He drove back to Station 4, Hatch in the back, the end of the shift 30 minutes out. The morning sat in the front of his mind the way significant mornings did, not fading the way routine calls faded, but staying present with a weight that was not quite discomfort and not quite clarity. He thought about Dennis Crail in the back of the cruiser, staring at the floor. He thought about Marcus Webb watching the tree line from the guardrail. He thought about 18 years of showing up, assessing and acting. About the framework that held when everything else was variables. About the things you notice in the first 4 minutes when you paid the kind of attention that couldn't be taught in a classroom, that came from being present, completely, for 11 years of other people's worst moments. At the station, Jim put Hatch in the yard and poured food into the lid of the blue container and sat on the back step with a cup of coffee that had been sitting too long. He drank it as it was. Hatch ate, then came and sat beside him on the step. They sat. At 9:47, Marcus Webb called. He said the stitches were done. 4 of them. He said the doctor had cleared him. He said the truck and the insurance and probably a lawyer in several months of his life. Then he said, is he okay? Jim looked at Hatch, sitting on the step beside him in the yellow light of the station's back entrance, with the night coming in over the lot. He's okay, Jim said. A pause. I've been thinking about what I said this morning, about you taking him. Jim waited. I meant it as a real question, not just for the day. Another pause. I work 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, travel 2 weeks a month. I got Hatch because I thought my hours were different than they are, and they're not. He's been alone a lot. That's not right for a dog like that. His voice shifted lower. For any dog, but especially not that one. Jim looked at the dog. Hatch raised his head and looked back. You don't have to, Marcus said. I just wanted to ask. He chose you this morning. I know that sounds like a lot to put on it, but I've had him 3 years and I've seen him make that call exactly once. So, Jim said, I'll take him. Marcus exhaled, long and slow. The breath of a man putting something down somewhere he trusted. Okay, he said. You'll want to visit. Yeah, I will. They hung up. Jim sat on the back step of Station 4 with the empty coffee cup in his hand and looked at the dog. He thought about Marcus saying, he decided, and about the 3 years Jim had spent not deciding. Every few weeks the thought arrived and then departed without resolution. Every few weeks he thought about the empty apartment and the refrigerator that was always half empty and the particular quality of silence in a place where there used to be an animal, and now there wasn't. And then he thought about something else and went to work, and the thought got filed with the other things he'd filed and didn't close. He thought about what kind of dog Hatch was, not the breed, the type. He'd known dogs like this in the Army, the working mows that paired with handlers in Kandahar and Mosul, the animals that had been trained into something more specific than the thing they'd been born as, not dangerous, not soft. Something in between that was harder to describe than either of those. Animals that had developed a kind of attention you couldn't train directly. You could train the components, the alertness and the response and the positioning, but the attention itself was something that came from within the animal, or didn't come at all. Some dogs developed it, most didn't. Hatch had it. Jim had seen it the first minute on the shoulder of Route 9, standing there watching Jim work the assessment with the specific focused calm of an animal that was processing what it saw and deciding what to do about it. He'd recognized it without being able to name it. The same way you recognize certain people, soldiers, medics, first responders, who had been through enough to develop that quality in themselves. Who showed up and saw what was happening and acted on the seeing without noise, without fanfare, without needing anyone to explain the situation to them. You either had that quality or you didn't. He looked at Hatch. Hatch looked back at him with brown eyes that were steady and clear and completely, unhurriedly present. Jim thought, I have been alone for 3 years. I have been doing this job for 11 years, and I have been in this county for 8 years, and I have 3 people in my life I could call at 2 in the morning if something went wrong, and I have not called any of them at 2 in the morning because nothing has gone wrong, nothing that required a phone call, just the ordinary accumulation of shifts and calls and the recurring dream where he was always moving and never arriving. Just that, he thought, I got Birch when I was 29. 2 years out of Mosul, 1 year into the paramedic certification, the particular rawness of a person who has been in a structure for a long time and has abruptly left it and is figuring out what comes next. He hadn't planned to get a dog. He'd walked past an adoption event at the Feed and Seed on a Saturday morning, and a yellow lab had put its head on the edge of the pen and looked at him, and he had walked in 10 minutes later and signed the paperwork before he had fully decided to. 14 years. It turned out a dog was exactly the right thing for the particular shape of a life like Jim's, something that needed consistency and was not damaged by solitude, that understood the rhythms of shift work, that was present without demanding performance. Birch had been a good dog. Hatch was a different kind of good. Jim set down the coffee cup and looked at the lot. The station lights made a yellow circle on the asphalt, and beyond the circle, the November dark was complete. He could hear the night crew inside, voices low, the particular quiet competence of people who worked well in the dark. He thought about Sonia in the back of the rig, holding Hatch's ear with both hands. The way the dog had simply been there, not doing anything, not performing comfort, just present, completely present. The way Jim had been trying to be present for 11 years and sometimes managed and sometimes didn't. The way Hatch managed it without apparent effort. He thought, some things fit. They hung up. Jim looked at Hatch. The dog had put his head back down on his paws, but his eyes were still open, tracking Jim with the patient, unhurried attention that Jim had recognized from the first minute on Route 9 and had not been able to name until right now. He named it now. It was the same thing Jim brought to every call, the same thing that had gotten him through Kandahar and through 11 years of overnight rotations and through 347 responses and through one Wednesday in November when a yellow lab died quietly and Jim had sat with him until it was over and then driven to work and not told anyone. The specific quality of attention that meant, I am here, I see what's happening, I will not look away. Hatch walked a half step ahead of Jim to the car, the way he would keep walking. Nobody needed to say anything. Nobody did. Some things don't ask permission. They just wait until you stop asking the wrong question. Then they walk beside you.